Like, they really hate that we bother teaching this in this course. And I, honestly, if it's not explained to you, if I were in your shoes and no one explained to me, like, I would think this is ridiculous as well. But here's the thing. So first off, if you go to a BSB, there is a couple different types of S2s that you will get. So number one is the Turd. And the Turd has been kicked out of at least 2 different other battalions, whether it be Combined Arms Battalion, Cavalry Squadron, BB, etc. Been kicked out of there from doing a poor job, kicked off brigade staff, and now, like, the BSB is the last chance saloon for this dude, right? So you've got the dude who is just so lazy and or incompetent, or both, that no one wants him, and now that's the dude who is doing your analysis. Is that what you want? Probably not, right? So especially if you're the S3 or a planner or SPO shop, like, someone needs to check that dude. And because, again, like, in a real operation, in a BSB, like, you may be not, like, on the fly, duking it out, but hybrid threat's a real thing, right? And figuring out what irregular forces are going to do and analyzing that, like, that affects lives. So someone needs to be able to do that. And the Turd should not be the only one doing it. 2, the other one you may have is, like, the wet behind the ears, so new he squeaks second lieutenant, who's straight out of Fort Huachuca and MI Bullock, and he or she, like, they could tell you every single thing about a T-80 down to, like, the difference in the different bolts used between a T-80 and a T-72. Does that help the BSB at all? No, right? They do not. They've all been prepped to go to a Combined Arms Battalion or a Light Infantry Battalion and do some high-speed analysis on dealing with what's happening at the FLOT, and they cannot tell you what type of terrain a HEMTT fueler can go up versus a M88, right? They don't know any of that. So someone needs to be able to help them and, like, do that analysis and get them caught up to speed. And then the third is just, like, the dude or dudette who's just filling a chair, right? They're just filling that slot. And they're doing the best they can, but they aren't MI either. They, just like you're not. But again, if we can get at least the basics of this down here, it will translate. As you go to plans phase also, we're going to start talking sustainment preparation of the operational environment, which is basically IPB geared towards opening theater entry and how we sustain a fight. And it's all, again, analyzing infrastructure and terrain and that hybrid threat that would affect logistics. So basically exactly what I'm about to talk about here, just not as pointed towards the maneuver side. So it does apply, and there are reasons we teach it here. So now that I can step back off my soapbox, going into IPB, right? We talked about on the in the last slide deck how we had IPB and we had running estimates. Two-Shop, listen to me, Two-Shop. You do not have running estimate slides. IPB, that's your running estimates. That's everything, all the factors at play here. So you do not need to stress about, like, okay, well, I need to know everything about terrain, weather, civil, and enemy, and I also need specified implied tasks. And no, you don't, right? This is your focus. The other staff sections handle that. You handle collating all the information for IPB. Again, not by yourselves, but those other warfighting functions will play ball with you, but you're still the one that meshes it into a coherent product. But looking at coming back, looking at what IPB is, right? Here are the 4 steps. So number 1 is define the operational environment. 2 is describe the effects on operation. So what is my box? What's inside my box with me? And then step 2 is why does that matter and how does it affect me? And then those two go together, right? So that's the terrain side of things, terrain and civil. And then we get into step 3, evaluate the threat. So who is the enemy? What do they consist of? What do they like to do given a perfect world? And then step 4 is we are meshing, the terrain, enemy, slow down a second, terrain, weather, and civil. We're meshing that with what the enemy likes to do and coming out with what the threat course of actions are. So that's how it all kind of steps into. And we be methodical about this. Do not try and scattershot it and start with the enemy, because you're just going to get confused, right? It is broken down into 4 steps for a reason. It is so that someone who's never done this before can read it and then do it. Just don't try and get fancy with it. All right, so step one, moving into define the operational environment. So as you can see, we are identifying for further analysis, so meaning identifying for step two, the significant characteristics or activities within the operational environment. Anything that can influence us or the enemy courses of action, or could have a decision for our boss or the enemy's boss, and then also the physical environment around. As you can see, I did leave some stuff in from sustainment intentionally, so that you can see, like, again, how it plays into down the road when you're doing this for a BSB or a CSSB, how it's still usable. I stripped out most of it, but I just still did leave some things. So the so what for this is we really get the baseline of here's where I am and here's what's with me, right? Because we don't figure that out, we're going to miss everything else. And if we do this right, we save time and effort because we understand our environment. We don't have to go back and like keep replanning for things as we find them out down the road. So the Army is real great at creating charts for things, and some of them are helpful, some of them are not. Generally the charts for the steps of IPB are not helpful, but don't worry, we'll talk about all the sub-steps. Right, so again, define the operational environment, which breaks down into these things below it. So we're identifying the area of operations, identifying area of interest, the significant characteristics of the area that we need to look at in the next step, anything that's happening now, and then any other information we need, and then how we're going to initiate getting that information. Next slide. Again, so this kind of breaks you down, right? How would you break it down? So you're going to have a slide. First off, right, the first IPB slide you need to have is, this is my AO, this is my area of operations, and this is my area of interest. We will get into the difference here in the next slide or two. And then at the end, we have the stuff that we need to focus the staff on. So, and the things we need help finding, whether that be RFIs to brigade or whoever, or we need to start making NAIs for our information collection plan, like we covered during mission analysis. Okay, so area of operations, right? It's the area that a certain unit owns. That's where they're going to operate. That's what it boils down to. You can see the definition on the slide. What it really boils down to is like, here's my box. The line determines what my box is and where I'm allowed to operate. So sometimes that's very defined for you. Sometimes it's like hard lines on a map, and if the boundaries are laid out clearly, sometimes they're not so clear cut. And you may find in this operation, it's not quite that clear cut. It may be multiple battalions on the same MSR to get to a point. It may be we're operating in a city and their objectives, but you may find when you get to coordinating instructions, I can't remember, that there are boundaries placed on you. They're just not quite listed out. So you need to hunt those down and figure out what those constraints are and how they apply. Because they're there. I promise you they're there. I made sure I wrote them in. So that's our AO, right? Area of interest is the area outside of our AO that can still affect us, right? So it can still, even though we don't own it, we're not going to necessarily operate there, it still plays a part on how I feel about things or what I'm going to do. So the area of interest, the area of operations, again, may be like hard boundaries, but the area of interest, it can be huge. And it all depends on what the factors are at play. So it may be that the outside of our AO, by about 15 clicks, is where the enemy's division reserve is. And we think that that division reserve could be triggered to support the enemy. So that means our area of interest needs to encompass where we think the division reserve is. For example, in plans phase, you're going to get there, and your AO is very defined, but the ISB is in a different country, right? And the ISB is where your stuff comes from, right? That's where all like commodities come from, is the ISB. And so if something happens to that ISB, then that affects our planning, how we're going to do things. That means our area of interest extends all the way to a different country as a VSB. So that's just an example. And then we have area of influence. So area of influence is, again, how it encompasses our AO, but also extends further because it's an area that I can affect either through indirect fire or direct fire. Example may be that our AO, and again, this is not part of the mission. Our AO ends at a river. So southern boundary is a river. But I can still, I've got tanks, right? They can shoot 3 clicks, 4 clicks. I can still, so my area of influence extends that far. Plus, if I have artillery assets attached to me or direct support to me, I may be able to reach 18 more clicks. So it's really how far I can influence and shoot and kill things beyond what my area of operations is. If there are any questions to differentiate those, please hit me up in the chat. Okay, so again, I beat this up. Here are the things that we have to talk about when we are defining the operational environment. We have to talk about enemy, terrain and weather, and civil. I know I said that we're only specifically looking at the terrain, weather, civil section here, and we look at enemy in the next set of steps. But there's an exception to that, and I'll get into it and I'll explain the why behind it. And so you can see the examples of what may affect friendly mission. I'm not going to go through each of those and why. So here's significant characteristics briefing, right? So here's this is just a tool of how S2s you can brief this and categorize it. And the biggest thing is don't put all this on the slide. Brief me, talk to me. And that's how you go about that. Sorry, my phone just buzzed beside me. It completely threw me off. Don't do that when you're briefing. Don't leave your phone right beside you. So, yes, back to that. Yeah, this is a briefing tool, right? So we don't, again, this goes back to cytology. We don't just want slides with all these words, right? We put big important sentences, overarching categories, right? And then we fill in the gaps through our words. But this is a good way to categorize it and break it down. Okay. Describing environmental effects on the operations. So we now know from step 1, we now know what's in our box with us. And that is through all categories. We know what's here, we know what our box is, and we know what's just outside of our box that we may also affect us. If we don't get this part right, if we don't plan this right, then again, it goes back to I'm not taking into account everything that I need to for my plan. And I'm just going to have to go back. Either A, people are going to die, or B, I'm going to catch it before we do it, and I have to go back and burn more time to plan effectively, which is also going to take away from the subordinate units planning time. As you can see, here's another one of these great Army charts on how we do things logically in a format that's not super helpful. Okay, so I talked about how we need to define, even though we're talking normally terrain and civil here, we also talk enemy in these first 2 steps. But the reason we talk about enemy is because we're treating them like a piece of terrain. So right now, you are not looking at them as a living, breathing entity, right? You are looking at them almost like you would look at a ridgeline or a mountaintop or something that would impede us, right? So this is where the enemy is in current time and space. And then also think of those range rings like topographic rings, right? So the more rings you see on a mountain or a ridge, the steeper it is and the harder it is to come by. The more rings you see going out for an enemy shows you how far out they can affect you. That's all I'm worried about, right? What is the effect on me? I'm not concerned about what their doctrine is. I'm not concerned about what they may do at this point in time. The point is just to let the commander see, okay, this is the battlefield as it sits. This is our contested space. This is uncontested. This is how the general dynamics of it. You don't need to go into analyzing the enemy beyond just who they are and where they are currently, and then what weapon systems they have that can reach. That's it. We're going to get into the deep dive on the enemy later. So it is very hard to do the irregular threat for this, right? Because the conventional threat's easy. We see like it's easy for SAT imagery or the cavalry squadron or UAVs to pick up tanks and BRDMs and BMPs, right? It is not easy to pick up a bunch of random dudes dressed like every other random dude in the operational environment. So we have to look at do we have any SIGACs? Do we have any knowledge of what the irregular threat likes to do? And then at that point, it's really just best guess, right? Because guess what? That's what S2s do. They guess. Like it's all made up, right? And as long as you can justify it and it logically fits in with some type of pattern, then you're good. They don't know. They're not magic. They don't have a crystal ball. Like they're just guessing, but they've been trained to know how people think and analyze what they've done in the past. That's the only difference. So you just got to do the same thing, albeit with much less time and training and money put into you to do it. So you're going to look at, it's going to talk about things like in Annex B, like, hey, these indigenous displaced personnel camps, the IDP camps, right? The SAPA likes to recruit from them, and they can blend in easily in these IDP camps. So if you look at it logically, you say, okay, that's a good place for them to be, right? Because they blend in, like there's constantly people going in and out, new faces. So it's an easy win for them. We also know that SAPA likes to attack softer targets like resupply convoys. They're not going to go after tanks and brats. They don't have explosively formed penetrators, like AQI did in Iraq. They're pretty rudimentary. So they're going to focus on the BSB. And so we need to look at, or maybe our FSC, right? So when we're looking at a regular threat and templating them, we just kind of template them in the vicinity of the IDP camps. And we look at like, okay, RPG-7, what's that kind of distance? And then we can have a range ring like that. That's how we do both. It is much easier to do regular threat, but we still have to give it our best go on the irregular threat. Okay, and then this is a threat overlay over here. Again, it's just unit icon and range rings. That's it. There we go. Next slide. Okay, so whoops, went too far. Okay, so now we get into terrain analysis, right? I've seen here that students are pretty good at analyzing natural terrain. They're pretty good at looking at like, okay, here's the rural area, here's what affects us, here's what doesn't, doing all of the so what's for that. They're not so good at doing it for complex terrain. So that man-made terrain, cities, urban areas, what have you. You have to focus on this, especially since initially the city that we're going to be operating in is like a city we're going to be operating in. So we need to really look at it. What is the so what? So S2s, when we're looking at this, and S4s, this matters for you as well, right? Because at some point we're going to have to move the FSC through there to conduct a resupply of 2.7. How wide are those streets? How sharp are the turns? What can the roadways support, an M88 coming through? Whatever, right? What are their capabilities and limitations as far as the infrastructure exists? S2s, you should be looking at like, okay, what kind of city is Imishli? Is Imishli a collection of mud huts occupied by goat herders? Or is it a major modern city with well-built concrete structures? The difference being mud huts provide no cover for the enemy. Like major cities, they do provide cover, which is going to drive up class 5 expenditure, right? When we're looking at it from a BSB perspective. For us, it's going to look at like dry casualty rates, because guess what? The enemy has more cover. The enemy's going to stay and fight more. So there's all kinds of factors that play into what a city is besides just there's a city there. Okay, great, cool. But like, what does that mean? What does that really mean? Okay, again, I'm not going to go into OOCOP, right? So you've been through BOLC, you understand. Again, students here have a pretty good understanding of OACOC. That's how you should brief it, right? That's how you break it down to brief. Just use OACOC example and go straight down the line. And you can do that for both natural and complex terrain. Just because it's a city or urban area doesn't mean OACOC goes out the window. All right, again, we're just talking key terrain. So I'll bring this one around, right? Key terrain is just like key tasks. If it does not provide you, key terrain gives a marked advantage to whoever owns it or can control it. If it does not provide you an advantage just because it's brigade's key terrain, does that mean it's your key terrain? Not necessarily, no. You should not have 8 pieces of key terrain. Your AO is much smaller than that. It needs to be what matters to us. So it may be that you identified a really good support by fire position, and that if you can get that position, you can get fires on the enemy from a protected area that will allow the assault force to come in or the breach force to come in and do their mission without having any conflicts of SDZs, anything. That's key terrain, man. Like, that's a good one. But that just because that's yours doesn't mean it's brigades, and that's okay. You can have different key terrain. You should have different key terrain. But you should also not, again, have, just like key tasks, you should have 8 or 10, right? Because now you just, like, what is important anymore? If everything's important, nothing's important. Okay, again, we look at obstacles. So you're going to have to do some obstacle analysis. It's there. I've given you composition. I've given you disposition of it, where it's at. But we need to look at, okay, what are they trying to do? What is their intent? And you can see the different effects of obstacles here and what that means. Another thing about terrain from a combined arms battalion perspective is that it's different than an IBCT. An IBCT, everyone's walking, right? No, that's not the case here. We have all different types of mobility. We have dismounted infantrymen. We have tanks. We have Brads. We have Humvees. We have all different types of things. You cannot do a MACU for every single type of mobility here. You're not expected to. Pick one that makes sense. So the most common one, a tracked vehicle, so tanks or Brads, that's perfectly acceptable. But then you need to be able to brief by exception, like, okay, so this severely restricted piece of terrain, we cannot get a tank or a Brad through, but dismounts will have no problem. You'll be able to brief that by exception. Okay, again, I just talked MACU. So you can see the things we need here. We need the terrain categorized. So one hash mark being restricted, meaning like it's going to slow us down, but we can do it just fine. Severely restricted means it is like impeding us to the point where we can't really move through it. We need, and that's the double hash. We need our avenues of approach from both sides, not just the way we're coming, but the way the enemy would come, for both ground and air. And we need key terrain. If you give me those things, it's a pretty good MACU. We need to do that. The way I tell coach students to do it is, and it's up to you, but have one MACU that shows the whole AO and looks at it from the rural perspective, right? So like, how are we moving through that natural terrain, and what all does that mean? And then you have a second one that's a blow up of a Meechley in that area that shows the urban and around the river. So that's how you get your point across. You don't have to have it all on one slide, just one tiny little thing. It's the way you best convey information, and that goes for anything, right? Whatever is the best way to convey the information to help a boss visualize what's happening, it's fine. It doesn't always mean less slide is better. It doesn't always mean more slides are better. It's just whatever works the best at that point in time for that thing. And then again, like I said yesterday, the MACU from brigade is not good. It is not meant to be good, right? The point is not to give you all the answers. It's to give you a jumping off point and to do further analysis. So if you just give me brigades over again, Team 3, you're not going to be doing so hot on points. Okay, and then there's just a good way to brief it right here, terrain effects. Okay, weather. Understand me now. The Army does not pay you the salary of a captain to get up there and say, On D-Day, there's a 40% chance of rain, and it's going to be hot, so soldiers should drink water. No, like, give me real analysis, people. Like, put some thought into it. What does the wind speed mean? Like, what does the wind mean? So also, if it says south, right, it means the wind is coming out of the south. It does not mean blowing south. So understand what that means, because a lot of students get it confused and they're like, oh, a southerly wind. The southerly wind is blowing north. A southern wind. That's where its direction is coming from, not where it's going towards. Because if you have it confused in your head, then you're going to have it confused in your head which way chemical munitions will blow. Because guess what? Wind speeds play a big part in the chemical munitions. If the wind is blowing towards the enemy, they're going to have to use, if they just dead set on using chemical weapons, they're going to have to use it further away from them, right? Because they don't want it blowing in their faces. They also may not want to, blow the chemical munitions back in the faces of a city they're trying to hold forever, right? They're trying to keep immediately, make it part of their country. So they want to gas all the people. Not yet, right? They wait 20 years down the road, right, till they start gassing their own people. They'll do it now. What is the effect of precipitation and visibility on our CAS and rotary wing operations? Right, because aircraft are affected by that kind of thing. And then we need aircraft, right, for this. We need that CAS and CCA. And then the list goes on and on, right? So there are multiple effects. As you can see on the weather chart, this is an example here. Fort Benning has a great breakdown of all the different aspects of military operations that are affected by weather and how. So you can see like what's affected by cloud cover, what's affected by precipitation. Very useful. That's the kind of thinking we were looking for here. Not just, the 5-day weather forecast from Stormy Weathers on Channel 6. Okay, so looking at civil considerations. So this goes into again, a deep dive here. You can do your PMISI and A-scope crosswalk. That is an effective way of doing it. When we start looking at this, and the great resource to use is Odin. It is linked at the top of the general page for this team. It is a TRADOC website, and it is basically because TRADOC created an entire, basically, fake world for us to plan off of. And so there's all the fake countries, right? Ethiopia, in case you didn't know, the country that you're in is really Azerbaijan. And so they have all this information on these fake countries. So you can use that to help develop your A-scope and your PMISI crosswalk. You can also use real Azerbaijan, right? Because it's going to talk about Amishli, but it's not going to necessarily tell you how big Amishli is. But Amishli is a real city. So you can go and you can just Google it and you can find the population, you can find all this stuff about it in conjunction with the fake civil dynamics that are available on Odin, and you come up with some really good stuff. You're not just making it up off the top of your head. It's there. It's real. And Odin is a great consolidated point for all of that. Tomorrow we'll talk about using it for understanding the enemy better. It has the entire worldwide equipment guide on there that gives great breakdowns of every piece of equipment in the world and what the ranges are and their strengths and weaknesses, pictures, all that stuff. But yeah, I'll save that for tomorrow. So, as you can see, how this affects sustainment preparation of the operation environment. Look at all that stuff. That's directly from, I used to know the name of the manual, but the SPOE doctrinal manual publication. Okay. Come on, switch slides. Okay, here's a good briefing tool. And this is just a good example, again, of the kind of stuff you're looking for. So, you can always reference these slides and be am I on the right track? Because this is straight out of ATP 2-01.3. This is not something I came up with. This is not something that some student came up with. This is what the Army says is a good example. So if you're struggling to think of how to brief civil and what things you should be looking for, here you go. Come back to this. All right. Again, this is just an example of kind of like what step 2 briefing part would look like. Notice this, don't put this on a slide over here on the far right. Don't do it. Don't do it. Okay, so that is step 1 and step 2. Man, nailed it right at half an hour. So what questions do we have for step 1 and step 2? Again, be methodical, guys. Like, don't jump ahead. Don't try and do multiple things at once. It's your first time doing it. Just do it step by step. What's here? What's here in my box? What is my box? And both enemy terrain, all of enemy terrain, weather, and civil. So we'll list them out. And then step 2 is, after you've listed them, go back and be like, what does this mean to me? How does it affect me? How does it affect the enemy? And we should be looking at it in terms of, this is an advantage to the enemy, this is an advantage to me. If there are no questions, that's all I've got. Again, if you've got an immediate question and I jump off before you can type it, then hit me in the chat, like private message. If it's later on, just ask your SGL who can get with me. And then tomorrow we will do the second half of IPB, which is enemy focused, and how we evaluate the enemy and how we determine what we think they're going to do. And that should be 30 to 45 minutes tops. And then that's it for mission analysis lectures. So, okay, team 3, please meet me in our team